This morning is Dr. Noga Efrati of the Hebrew University. Dr. Efrati is a research fellow at the Truman Institute and since 2006 has headed the Truman Institute's post-Saddam Iraq research group. Her forthcoming books are Past Meets Present, Women in Iraq, and Post-Saddam Iraq, New Realities, Old Identities, Changing Patterns, which she co-edited with Professor Amnon Cohen, whom I'm glad to see here this morning. Dr. Efrati's talk is entitled From Nuri Saeed to Nuri al-Maliki, National Leaders in Iraq.
Thank you. Before the war in Iraq, many had hoped that with the removal of Saddam's regime, the country would enter a new phase in its history. But the ensuing occupation by US-led coalition forces, the rise of communalism, and the country's barely arrested slide into civil war shattered these hopes. Efforts to understand the unfolding events and the ongoing search for solutions in the political level also influenced the field of academic research on Iraq. Until 2003, an explanatory tension between structure and agency formed the basis of debate on the origins and nature of the government of Saddam. Iraq's traumatic history was often interpreted as either preordained by inherent contradictions aggravated by the evolution from Ottoman district to British mandate and then to independent state, or instead a case of viable polity hijacked by a ruthless and tyrannical regime. Receiving considerable attention in post-Saddam Iraqi studies is the rise of communalism and the intercommunal strife, presented as the main structural factor that determined the path of Iraqi history all through the 20th century. Many studies with such structuralist focus often imply that by establishing modern Iraq, the British authorities artificially tied together different regions inhabited by diverse religious, ethnic, and tribal groups under the roof of a nation-state which never developed into a genuine nation. In contrast, other, mainly Iraqi scholars, rediscovered Iraq's Ottoman and Mamluk past and found there the seeds for the subsequent emergence of Iraq as a state and a national community. Still others argued that while Iraq may have been artificially created in 1921, Iraqis did not remain static. People changed and created new realities. They developed into citizens of a state by going to the same schools, learning the same language, and sharing mutual suffering. The assumption that deep age-old internal divisions determine the path of Iraqi history was also undermined by those researchers who argued that the failed attempt at state building in Iraq by Western occupiers, first the British and now the Americans, was the result of their distorted view of Iraqi society. Lately, some researchers have explored a middle-of-the-road approach, juxtaposing external and internal factors, structural constraints, as well as Iraqi agency in the process of nation building and state formation in Iraq. I think Barham, Ronen, and Zeidel's book is a good example. Much of my forthcoming work on the monarchy period was devoted to Iraqi agency, but I also could not help by noticing the extent to which Iraqi efforts were devoted to exposing and overthrowing structural constraints imposed by the British on Iraq's polity. On the eve of American withdrawal from Iraq, however, I believe it will be interesting to revisit pre-2003 scholarly literature on Hashemite Iraq and point out and point out structural constraints that America, much like Britain before it, imposed on Iraq in order to secure its regional domination. I believe that Iraq's leaders endeavor, as they might, to represent all Iraqis or the Shi'i majority and serve the interest of an independent Iraq, actually and probably inadvertently follow the footsteps of their Sunni predecessors of the monarchy period. And this is to a large extent the result of the fact that the US is retracing much of the path taken by the British in Iraq. To illustrate my point, I would like to offer a brief, very brief, comparison between Nuri al-Maliki, Iraq's Shi'i prime minister since 2006, and Nuri Said, Iraq's Sunni prime minister 14 times between 1930 and 1958. It is very interesting to note, for example, the similarities between the platforms of Nuri Said party, al-Ittihad al-Dusturi, from 1949, and the platform of Nuri al-Maliki's party, Dawlat al-Qanun, from 2010. Both Nuriyan clearly reject sectarianism and present themselves as staunch supporters of the kind of nationalism that melts together the different elements of Iraq into a harmonious whole. Both promise to transform Iraq into a modern state through far-reaching reforms to the benefit of all Iraqis. Both, however, ignore the unique grievances of the disempowered community, the Shi'i community in the case of Said, and the Sunni community in the case of al-Maliki. Ignoring their concerns, they pledge to seek cooperation with the Arab people in the case of Said, and with neighboring countries in the case of al-Maliki. Both pledge that the Iraqi constitution, which bolsters the privileged position of their respective sects, would be the basis for their policies. Both promise to end, in case of al-Maliki, or to change, in case of Nuri Said, Iraq's relations with the foreign power and secure Iraq's independence and national sovereignty. Here, al-Maliki, much aware of his predecessor's experience, seemed to have done his utmost not to be seen as the local link which enables foreign dominance over Iraq. This is abundantly clear throughout the negotiations over the status of forces agreement between the US and Iraq in 2008. To many Iraqis, this agreement was the reincarnation of the much-loathed 1930 Anglo-Iraqi Treaty, a treaty which ended the British mandate but retained British control over Iraq for decades. The 1930 treaty opened the way for Iraq to be accepted to the League of Nations in 1932 as an independent state. In return, however, Iraq agreed to give Britain use of all her facilities and all assistance in her power in the event of war, including the right to move British troops through Iraq. It was also agreed that the Royal Air Force be allowed to maintain 2 major bases and that the Iraqi army, equipment, and military advisor would be supplied by Britain. The treaty was bitterly opposed by nationalists. The leaders of Iraq who agreed to its terms, most prominent among them Nuri Said, were presented as collaborators and traitors. In May 2008, after Iraqi negotiators briefed lawmakers concerning American demands, Iraqi politicians denounced the US proposals and compared it to the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty. According to Western media, under the terms of the proposed pact, America would retain long-term use of about 50 bases and control over Iraqi airspace. American forces would have a free hand in conducting military activities without consulting the Iraqi government. Opposition to initial US demands, in fact, brought together rival Sunni, Shi'i, and Kurdish leaders. They all complained that all real power would be left in American hands. Some, like Muqtada Sadr and members of the Sunni Association of Muslim Scholars, rejected the idea of a pact altogether. Iraq's leaders, they said, are ignoring the will of the people in order to retain their own position and present Iraq to its enemy on a plate of gold. Iraq will lose once again its sovereignty and wealth under what, in essence, will be an American mandate over Iraq. Prime Minister Nuri al-Maliki and his cabinet agreed to the idea of a pact, but rejected certain articles they saw as infringing on Iraq's sovereignty. Iraqi negotiators had 100 requests for changes. The negotiation results, however, are what's important to us here. To begin with, the agreement no longer titled Status of Forces Agreement, but the pact between the United States of America and the Republic of Iraq on the withdrawal of United States forces from Iraq and the organization of their activities during their temporary presence in Iraq. Second, the agreement sets the end of June 2009 as the deadline for US combat troops to withdraw from all Iraqi cities, and the date for all US troops to leave Iraq is the end of December 2011. Third, it stressed respect for Iraqi sovereignty and clearly stated that all military operations are to be carried out with the agreement of the Iraqi government and to be fully coordinated with Iraqi authorities. Fourth, the pact also stated that Iraqi land, sea, and air shall not be used as a launching or transit point for attacks against other countries. Finally, it allowed the US to retain, equip, and arm the Iraqi security forces. On the eve of concluding the agreement, Nuri al-Maliki was acutely aware of the historical moment. It will go to the record, his aides said, that he is the man that forced the Americans to leave. But can the pact be considered great victory for Iraq or Nuri al-Maliki? It no doubt ended the US-led occupation. But the Americans, by this point, November 2008, did not want to stay. Certainly not with the forces they had in the country after the surge, and especially after the victory in the US presidential elections of Barack Obama, who promised a quick withdrawal from Iraq. It is noteworthy that the pact actually allowed the Americans to stay another 3 years. In addition, the Bush administration had adopted a much looser interpretation than the Iraqi government on several key positions. The provision requiring the US to notify Iraqi officials in advance of any planned military operation was seen by US military officials as an invitation to an ambush. But the Bush administration interpreted it to mean that US commanders would merely need to inform their Iraqi counterparts that they plan to launch counterterrorism operation somewhere in an Iraqi city or province, sometimes during a certain month. Administration officials also contended that they could launch military operations into neighboring countries from Iraqi territory, citing another provision that allows each party to retain the right of self-defense. This provision, they claimed, allowed America to pursue groups that launch strikes on US targets from Syria or Iran. A more complicated and seemingly innocent provision allowed the US to leave behind advisors and to retain, equip, and arm Iraq's security forces. But in the past, Britain controlled Iraq to a large extent through the advisors the 1930 treaty allowed it to leave behind. Already in December 2008, Pentagon planners admitted that although the pact calls for all American combat troops to be out of the cities. Many will stay behind as trainers and advisors in what are effectively combat roles. At the end of August 2010, President Obama declared that the US combat mission in Iraq is over. 50,000 US troops were left behind. Their primary mission is to advise and assist the Iraqi security forces. At this point, their mission is time limited until the withdrawal by the end of 2011. But are the security forces in Iraq ready for their tasks? According to most reports, not quite ready. Here we should remember that one of the first steps the US took in Iraq was the dissolving of the Iraqi army. The dismissal of 400,000 professional soldiers created profound security vacuum in which party-affiliated militias and insurgents competed for control. In October 2010, Iraq's Chief of Staff, General Babakir Zebari, pointed out that the Iraqi army has been trained by the US to fight the armed insurgency and internal terrorism. We still do not have intelligence services, air or naval forces worthy of their names, he said. And we are unlikely to have an army capable of defending the nation before 2020. He blamed America for abandoning his country to an uncertain fate. The current state of the army will probably drive those who fear the consequences of American withdrawal to support American continued presence as trainers and advisors after 2011. But American control over Iraq is even further rooted in the provision that allows the US to train, equip, and arm the Iraqi security forces. The Iraqi Air Force is a good example. Since 2003, most personnel in the new Iraqi Air Force have been trained on US equipment by US forces. The Americans did not start training Iraqi pilots until September 2007, and we know that it takes about 7 years to become an experienced pilot. Because of the advanced technology involved in US-produced military systems, it will take even more time to create an operational air force. Not before 2020, according to sources in Baghdad. America in 2011, like Britain in 1932, is thus leaving Iraq while staying much in control, and Nuri al-Maliki, who seems to have been doing his best not to follow the other Nuri's footsteps, finds himself under similar structural constraints of his predecessor. And these have nothing to do with any Sunni-Shi'a historical fault lines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Efrati. It's a salutary reminder with everything that's been happening around us for the past couple of months that Iraq is still very much a focal point of interest and of significance. And in fact, we will stay with Iraq for our second talk. Our speaker is Dr. Ronen Zeidel, who is Director of Research at the Center for Iraq Studies in the University of Haifa and a member of the Iraq Study Group here at the Truman Institute. For some 20 years, he has been studying the history of Iraq and has published extensively on a wide range of subjects, including the commemoration of fallen soldiers, the Sunnis in Iraq, and the roles of tribes in Iraqi history. He is the co-editor of Iraq Between Occupations, Perspectives from 1920 to the Present, which was published last year, and an Arabic version of his article, The Iraqi Novel and the Shia, is forthcoming in an academic journal in Baghdad. Dr. Zeidel will speak about negative versus positive sectarianism, manifestations of Taifiyya in contemporary Iraq. And I'd like to speak on that.
Thank you very much. Good morning. And thank you, Etan, thank you, Noga, for coming up with the term that Nuriyani, that I will use in my forthcoming lectures when I speak about comparisons in Iraqi history. That's very useful. And I hope the content of my lecture now will not be given to the Iraqis because if they hear what I say, they will not publish my article in Baghdad. It runs counter to their beliefs to hear what I'm going to say about sectarianism, and especially the fact that there is positive, I put it in brackets, you know, positive, and not only negative sectarianism. So here I am. There's no doubt that the Iraqi approach to sectarian identity has changed dramatically since 2003, and probably even before it. Yet, as some of you may have noticed, there is a problem with the title of my paper, as in the eyes of most Iraqis, there is no such thing as positive sectarianism or Taifiyya. This ambiguity is salient in every sphere, and politics is only one of them. Nuri al-Maliki is seen by many as a politician that fosters sectarian feelings. Yet, opposition to sectarianism was one of the main themes in his election campaign. The two winners of the last elections, Maliki's State of Law and Iyad Alawi's al-Iraqiyya, were united in their rejection of sectarianism, yet disguised a rather homogeneous sectarian formation. Almost all the members of Alawi's list were Sunnis, and almost all the members, basically all the members of Maliki's list were Shi'is. Finally, the demonstrators in Baghdad's Tahrir Square, I wanted to say Tahrir Square so that you ask me, yeah, are you talking about Cairo now? No, we have our own Tahrir Square in Baghdad, which I must say is more impressive than the one in Cairo. And the demonstrators there are united, unanimous in their opposition to the Muhassasa, the much-hated nomination of state officials and apportionment of jobs according to sectarian lines. So, my question is, where exactly is the line between positive, quote-unquote, and negative, quote-unquote, sectarianism? I will not speak about politics for a change. My examples will come from the intellectual and literary sphere. I will discuss two books published in 2010, not my book, which was published in 2010, other books. The first is Abdul Hussein al-Sha'ban's Jadl al-Hawiyat fil Iraq, which I have here. This book, The Dispute of Identities in Iraq, and it has a subtitle, Ad-Dawla wal-Muwatana. And at this point, I wanted to wave my newly acquired Iraqi identity card. I have an Iraqi identity card. Only the cover, of course, but an Iraqi identity card all the same. Ad-Dawla wal-Muwatana, of course, is a state and citizenship. Iraqi. It was acquired in Kurdistan, by the way. The book was published in Beirut. Sha'ban, whose name is the most sectarian one can think of, Abdul Hussein Sha'ban, is she, of course, an ex-communist, an Iraqi expat, and a lawyer. He is not a distinguished intellectual, I must say. I like working with intellectuals who are not so distinguished because they make you, they give you a sense of where things really are, you know. But certainly is a prolific writer. Sha'ban is an adherent of an overall identity, composed of secondary identities. He says, every person in Iraq has more than one identity, but his overall identity is Iraqi. Every identity, the secondary and by consequence the overall, is a continuous, open and creative project. عملية إبداعية مستمرة ومفتوحة. This dispute between identities is natural, according to him, but it should not develop into a struggle or sira. This view goes along with the official line of the Iraqi state, speaking and actually asserting, emphasizing the national fabric, or al-Nasij al-Watani, which is an overall identity composed of secondary identities that enrich, in their turn, the overall identity. In Sha'ban's view, the open identity rejects hegemony and its subordination to other officially imposed identities. He goes on to criticize the Arab world for failing to acknowledge and contain secondary identities, and argues that in Arab states, the identity of the nation will frequently be that of the ruling elite. Evidently, this also applies to pre-2003 Iraq. This situation, in which the open expression of certain identities is officially prohibited by the regime and official identities are imposed on the people, makes everyone, according to Sha'ban, political along ethnic, national, religious, or madhabi lines. This turns the dispute into a struggle between identities, which might be used by foreigners to weaken the overall identity. Sha'ban speaks about three aspects of change after 2003. The weakening and gradual disintegration of the state, once a major actor in politics, made people return from what he calls marja'iyat al-dawla to al-marja'iyya taqlidiyya, the traditional marja'iyya. Second, the introduction of the muhassasa, for which he blames Paul Bremer and the American-appointed interim government, which is what Iraqis often do. Last, political sectarianism, which existed since the establishment of the Iraqi state, and he gives an interesting analysis of that, and with interesting details of how it was carried out behind the screens of the Iraqi state, was transformed into what he calls societal sectarianism, Taifiyya mujtama'iyya, which is even worse. Here he uses Ali al-Wardi, the famous Iraqi sociologist, term religionless Taifiyya, Taifiyya bila din, meaning a social signifier used to set people apart from each other in a general context of animosity. At this point, Sha'ban discusses another aspect of negative, quote-unquote, sectarianism, which is the implementation of federalism in Arab Iraq, a political campaign promulgated by Shi'i politicians to establish a southern region, Iqlim al-Janub, with the holy cities at its center. While accepting Kurdish rights to federalism as the only way to avoid their secession, not because he agrees with Kurdish federalism, Sha'ban argues that federalism may contribute to the development of the state only if it is buttressed by cultural and historical developments that Iraq has not seen yet. Urgent problems, the solution of which is used to justify Shi'i federalism, should be solved by the constitution and not by the geographic division of Iraq. The best solution for Iraq's conflicting communities, according to Sha'ban, and identities, comes in the form of a modern state based on equality, civil rights, a unifying constitution without privileges to sects or ethnic groups. This state will respect the secondary identities that compose the overall national identity and not try to eliminate them. I chose this rather banal analysis because it reflects the view of an overwhelming number of Iraqi intellectuals on sectarianism. The author is Shia, and his analysis of the situation in pre-2003 Iraq is typical to secular Shi'i intellectuals. I'm saying secular Shi'i intellectuals, I do believe in this term, who cannot ignore their past inferiority and marginalization, while not exactly confirming to the sectarian agenda of today, especially its political and religious aspects. But the real reason for choosing this book is because the author proposes a draft law, at the end of the book, a draft law to outlaw, which is what the term I use for tahrim, his term was tahrim, at-Taifiyya, the outlaw sectarianism and strengthen citizenship. Though this law has no chance to be accepted, it helps to understand the various revelations of negative, quote-unquote, sectarianism and partly answers our initial question of where to draw the line. This draft is very severe it calls for the elimination of all forms of Taifiyya and for punishing harshly, not as now, attention, its perpetrators, those who profit from it, and even those who accept it silently. Taifiyya is thereby defined as no less than high treason, khiyana udma. The 17 articles of the law are divided into two fields, civil and religious. In the religious field, the law contains a prohibition to use religious events for spreading sectarianism. Please note that Ashura is defined as a religious and not a sectarian event. B, a prohibition on ulama to publish fatwas with public interest, especially regarding ethnic and sectarian issues. C, a prohibition to use mosques for sectarian incitement. D, all the holy shrines will be administered by the state through the Ministry of Awqaf. The internal division of this ministry into Sunni and Shi'i Waqf will be cancelled. E, prohibition of the involvement of non-Iraqis in the administration of the holy places. This is a joke and an affront to the Shia and the Hausa and also to a certain guy named Ali Sistani, you know. I, diplomas given by the religious institutions of education will not be recognized unless they conform to the standards of the education system of the state. I guess in Israel it sounds familiar. In the civil field, we have A, the distribution of governmental and non-governmental jobs on sectarian basis will be strictly forbidden. No muhassasa any longer. B, the nomination of judges on sectarian basis is prohibited, and verdicts issued by such courts will be recalled. That's really bad, that you have judges nominated on sectarian grounds and they issue verdicts on sectarian grounds. C, a prohibition on the use of sectarian slogans in the education system, which is another affront on the Shia because the Ministry of Education is one of their bastions. Since 2005, all of Iraq's ministers of education were Shia. D, health institutions established on sectarian lines will be subordinate to the state and, of course, open to all. E, a prohibition on the publication and distribution of works of art and cultural products that include sectarian propaganda. I wonder if the internet is also included. To better understand where the line is, I now move to the individual level. I will do it through a novel. The novel is called The Pomegranate Alone, Wahduha Shajarat al-Roman, by Sinan Antoun, published in Lebanon in 2010. Sinan, who happens to be a good friend of mine, but this is not why I chose the novel, is a Christian, an Iraqi patriot, and a staunch opponent to sectarianism, and yet, in his first novel, I'jam, he brought forward his Chaldean family background to outline his opposition to sectarian closure. He's also running for some posts in Mesa, I was informed recently, so that's something to be put out. In his second novel, Wahdu Shajarat al-Ruman, written in the first person, he is the absolute other, as far as he is concerned. He's Jawad, a Shi'i, who stayed in Iraq and works as a marasilji. You know what a marasilji is? That's a hell of a job, really. He's a body washer, a profession he inherited from his father. Working with dead bodies, his father had the only maraisala for Shi'is in Baghdad. So, of course, this brings him into confrontation with the sectarian division because they are divided, you know, only Shi'i dead are washed in his maraisala. All the other Shi'i maraisalas, by the way, moved to Najaf. Confront him with sectarian differences in traditions and rites, which are not that big. Like many other Iraqis of his status and education, Jawad never attached much importance to his being Shi'i. This is not the case with his parents, especially his mother, who is more pious and sectarian. in 2006, he will have to face, in the most, I must say, morbid way, the murderous aspects of sectarian relations. Since then, his position with regard to sectarianism is one of the main themes of the novel. Jawad is torn. At work, he will treat the victims of sectarian violence, only the Shi'is, obviously, but his deep humanity will make him see the other side. At home, he will be affronted by his mother, blaming him for not really caring for the Shia. In his despair, he yearns for the disappearance of the terms Shia and Sunna from the vocabulary altogether, and he also wants to leave the country. Before he tries to do that, he goes with his mother to the Kadhimiya mosque, which is not so far from where they live, in Kadhimiya. This is Yawm al-Ghadir, a very important Shi'i festival, and many pilgrims are at the mosque. He shuts his eyes and he starts crying. Why? He's crying for himself, for the bitter fate of his friends, but also out of identification with Musa bin Ja'far, the 7th Shi'i Imam, poisoned in jail on orders of Harun al-Rashid, who is buried in that shrine. This secular identification with heroes of Shi'i history appears in some other places in this novel and is a label of a recent trend in the Iraqi novel. It goes hand in hand with the construction of a secular Shi'i narrative, blending the canonic events of classical history with modern events from Iraqi history. The 1920 revolt, the transfer to Iran of Shi'is by the Ba'ath in the 70s and 80s, and obviously the Intifada of 1991. So far, all the writers of the new wave were Shi'is. I chose Sinan Antun, the first non-Shi'i, to write like this, to show where the line is. Now, where the line is. Both writers agree that personal sectarian identity should be permitted, or at best, tolerated. This will not be defined as Taifiyya, and a variety of evasive terms will be used to describe that. What is it? Hawiyya, Shi'iyya, many other evasive terms instead of the term Taifiyya, with a negative connotation. When I asked Sinan, where does he put the line? I sent him an email a few days ago, after finishing the novel. He came up with an evasive answer, that sectarianism is not the cause but the effect. This is what many Iraqis are saying, especially those who used to belong to the Iraqi Communist Party. And that one should look at the historic context. Contextualization is also another means of dissimulating or simulating a sectarianism. For him, as well as most other Iraqi intellectuals, as long as this identity is peaceful and confined to the religious and cultural spheres, there is nothing wrong with it. However, its penetration to the political, judicial, and administrative fields should strictly be avoided. Nevertheless, there is a twilight zone in the passage between individual and the collective. Ashura, as you probably know, is not the expression of personal sectarian identity. 6 million people take part in the celebrations of Ashura, and then there are Bayniya with about the same number. The intellectuals know that one cannot limit this phenomenon to the individual level. It's not possible. It doesn't work this way. The right to perform these religious rituals is now enshrined in the permanent constitution from 2005. Thus, nobody speaks about getting back to pre-2003 prohibitions and restrictions on the Ashura, on the Mawakib, on many other Shi'i religious and sectarian rites. For all of them, the new reality is inconvenient and contains many dangers. For Shi'i writers, the dilemma is more personal and unresolved. Personally, they abhor collective expressions of sectarianism. participation in religious rituals, voting as a sect and for a sectarian candidate, but they will strictly oppose their total prohibition and even restriction. Non-Shi'i writers would aspire to the total elimination of all kinds of sectarian identity, realizing that this is not possible in post-2003 Iraq. What these two very different books are doing, along with many others, is the redefinition of a new Iraqi national identity that would both contain and legitimize the sectarian identities and thus mitigate the tensions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zeidel, for this very interesting talk, and thank you both for adhering to the timetable. And our third and last speaker this morning at this session is Dr. Eldad Pardo, who is a senior researcher at the Truman Institute, teaches at the Hebrew University in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies and the Rothberg School. He's director of the study group on Iran in the research project Text Mining in Religious Studies within the GIF, the German Israel Foundation. His book, Predicting Revolutions, Iranian Cinema and the Iranian Revolution, was published 10 months ago. Dr. Pardo headed two research groups at the Truman Institute, Iran in Global Perspective and Religious Actors in Conflict Areas. And the title of his lecture is Shi'ism and the Iranian Revolution, Liability or Asset.
Thank you, dear Chair, Professor Kohlberg, and thank you for the committee for inviting me to this very auspicious conference. I see this is an early morning, not so many people have come, but I'm still very inspired by the lectures and what we heard yesterday. What I'll try to do in this presentation is I'll try to divide my time into two sections. I'm speaking about Shi'ism and the Iranian Revolution, whether it's an asset or a liability. So what I'll do at the beginning of the talk is to go back a little bit to the original Islamic Revolution. Even though we're talking about Middle East in transition now, first of all, by going back to the original revolution, we can a little bit learn about what is Shi'ism when it comes to the Iranian regime, at least. This is, of course, a very intimidating project, considering that Professor Kohlberg is here. Also, I will draw some comparisons, or at least point to some interesting dilemmas that are connected to theory revolutions and what we are witnessing in Egypt and Tunisia today. The second part, I will try to present how the way I see the Iranian situation right now vis-a-vis the new waves of revolutions in the Arab world, but from the perspective of this Shiite revolutionary ideology, how all this fits. I hope I can make this challenge. I will start by reading a little bit and then talking. The wave of revolutions and unrest in the Arab world, and particularly the fast and effective revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, caught many observers and scholars by surprise. While the timing and the magnitude of these collective social movements are important dimensions of the surprising turn of events, perhaps the largest surprise was the vocabulary, as we heard yesterday, the vocabulary of the revolutionaries, or what it was not a vocabulary. It was not the vocabulary of political Islam, of either the radical or the moderate version. The 1978-9 Islamic Revolution of Iran presented a similar surprise to Iran experts of the time. The main surprise then and now was the vocabulary of the revolution. No one had expected the Iranians, and for that matter any other nation, to apply the epitome of traditionalism, a medieval religion, to serve as an effective ideology for a revolution. I need the watch, because I have two timings to take. So I'll have to judge myself, sorry. Okay. Okay. No one expected that this religious ideology would provide a sturdy and vibrant underpinning for an innovative and relevant political system that was and still is, more than 3 decades later, capable to scare the world. Of course, no one expected a revolution to occur in Iran at all, particularly as the country was enjoying an all in all unprecedented economic prosperity, albeit experiencing at the time of the revolution a relative slowdown. Economic numbers were not those of 2011 Egypt. I would like to mention that revolutionary theorists of the time were surprised also by 2 other elements. First of all, the large amount of people participating, about 10% of the Iranian population, which still makes the Iranian revolution the largest in history, both in numbers and in percentage. 3 million people participating in the large demonstrations. And then when welcoming Khomeini, one could say after the revolution, 6 million people participated. Also, the fact that the revolution took place only in cities was also an innovation at the time. This was indeed a strategic surprise, but the emergence of a religious polity, a holy regime, Nizam Muqaddas in Persian, that is modern, powerful, and relevant, was perhaps more than just a national revolution. It was a challenge to Western philosophy and worldview, as it was a challenge to the West's strategic interests. In other words, while Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions are, more than anything else, revolutions without particular ideology, the people want the demise of the regime. Ashab Yurid Diskhat Nizam, we heard about that. Of course, they speak about there are flags, you know, they were given flags, democracy, human rights, and so on. But I follow here an Iran expert, a very famous one, Amir Saidar Jomand, from a not very well article that he wrote about the revolutions in Eastern Europe, which carried a non-ideological ideology of freedom and normalcy as an answer to decades of stifling communism. So I think what we see in the Arab world today is a non-ideological revolution, and I think this is Arjuman's point. The Islamic revolution of Iran, however, was extremely ideological. It targeted not only the Shah, but the entire world system of the time, both strategically and ideologically. It set out to address the separation of state and church as advanced by the American constitutions, by the American and French constitutions, and even more so, for the anthropocentric French constitution that is more secular than the Americans, and definitely Marxist-based communism. Hence, the Islamic revolution of Iran was not only Iranian, Islamic, or Shiite, but aspired and still do aspire to fundamentally change the relationship between humans and the divine by dismantling the Enlightenment project and reinstating God as an active actor in society. Iran is a religious actor. Hence, Islamic discourse was chosen at the time not only as argued by Muad'Dil, because, this is, by the way, a very good source for theory revolutions, because by and large it was available, considering that the Persian nationalist and the Western modern discourses have been used already by the regime, or because Marxist-Leninist. What Muad'Dil is arguing is basically that you have a number of discourses available, that there is a kind of a market of discourses. The Shah used the Persian and the Western. The Marxist-Leninists were persecuted. So what was left was Islam. So they had to choose Islam. They chose Islam, and this was what made this discourse winning. I think this is a very good theory that can help a lot of things in the world. However, what happened in Iran was also a development of an extremely sophisticated ideology that started working on itself and developing itself from the beginning of the 1960s at least. And this also goes back to the times of before Bourdieu's death in 1961. So one can also talk about the 30s and 40s, influence of the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. So when they reached the revolution, those people that were considered really primitive and old-fashioned actually held in their hand a very sophisticated and relevant ideology that simply was intellectually superior to any other alternative. So it was not only that it was available, but that it was much more efficient, and they just did much more homework. And here I'd like to go to a little bit to the question of the Shi'ism of okay, to the Shi'ism of Ayatollah Khomeini. I would like to quote late Professor Chava Lazarus-Yaffe. She wrote in 1981 that Shi'ism in Khomeini's ideology was minimal. She says, the centrality of a detailed political theory in the thought of a Muslim scholar, Sunni or Shi'i, should be seen as an innovation in Islam that have appeared as a result of Western influence, especially at a time when Islamic revival reaches its apex and is manifested in the rejection of the West and its culture. Indeed, Khomeini's religious ideology borrowed, as I said, from Muslim Brethren, from the French and American and Bolshevik revolution. By countering them, they borrowed from them. Also, they were also heavily influenced by the 1960s Israel socialist ideologies, which had been represented, as I've shown, by Jalal al-Ahmad in his 1964 book, Velayat Israel. In Israel, there is presented as the land of the prophets, and a utopian religious polity. More important also is the fact that Israel at the time allowed itself to consider itself as leader for the entire Jewish population of the world, a kind of Jewish ummah, and also not always to obey international law because it had some divine mission. Of course, there was also, as Amir Said Arjuman speaks, about revolutionary, about a Sunnitization of Shi'ism. Shi'ism became from passive religion into active religion. Kramer calls it new religion, and so on and so forth. So here we can see that this sophisticated ideological reshaping of Shi'ism, making it actually almost a new religion, a new religion except for the basic text and rituals, but from very other aspects, one can talk there about entirely a new worldview. If we go back to the power struggle in post-Mubarak Egypt, we should keep in mind that these two elements of surprise seem not to be available to any of the party. The ideology of both the secularists and the Muslim Brethren are pretty much known. Indeed, the most surprising is the use of democratic slogans by Egyptian revolution, but the ideological underpinnings of democracy and human rights are familiar. Also, the Egyptians are aware of the development. This is another point to remember about the revolution in Egypt, and was also important in the revolution in Iran. People learn history. They know what happened before. What happened in Iran was that there were a number of events, mainly the constitutional revolution of 1906, 1911, in which we saw a coalition of religious people, clergy and secular people, working together to change the regime. In the end, the secular people took power. Now, what happened in 1979? The religious people, particularly Khomeini, learned from history, and they decided this time it is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So we had the seculars believing that history would repeat itself, while the clergy, or Khomeini, said, okay, I'm learning from history, so history would not repeat itself. when we look at Egypt, you know, we have this fear that, you know, the Islamic radicals or Islamic Brotherhood will take over the revolution because we have experienced a similar phenomenon, not exactly the same phenomenon, in Iran. But the Egyptians also know about the Iranian precedent. So this, in itself, the fact that it happened before, makes it more problematic to repeat this scenario. So this is also something that we have to consider. Okay, I think I'm in half time. Am I right?
You're fine.
Okay, so I'll go to speak about what is going on in Iran today, and I would like to point out that the combination of on the one hand, this Shi'i aggressive, revolutionary, even violent ideology on the one hand, and the authoritarian nature of the regime, both of them together pose great difficulties for Iran. And we've seen a lot of these problems in the past. Just to mention one is the very long war against Iraq that was really not necessary. Iran was not able to achieve economic independence. It is still very much relying on its oil, and this is because of this type of ideology and the regime, and it faces a lot of other problems in its endless effort to export the revolution because of this changed Shiite ideology of a universal new religion. Now, the question is, when did this wave of revolution start? And we see the Green Movement in Iran argues that it actually started in Iran in June 2009, and we've seen there a really change in the attitude of the population towards the regime until June 2009, and this was pretty clear to me and to others that for a long time, and to a certain extent it's true even today, the Iranians did not want to change the regime. They wanted to reform the regime. They wanted to open it up. In June 2009, the regime rigged the elections, or this is the perception, and in that sense, the chances for reforming the regime fell apart, and this led to the first wave of unrest. A second wave of unrest came recently following the revolutions in the Arab world, and indeed they call it shurui dobare. They call it going back, starting again. We've seen in all the slogans, and I won't read to you all the list of the slogans that I have here, that they are really fed up of the involvement in the Arab world and would like to focus on Iran. So in that sense, the situation in Iran, from the point of view of the population, is similar to what we see in the Arab world. Great interest in a non-ideological change. Just it can be a reform, it can be opening up. There is no counter-ideology, and also there is a great interest in focusing on the real issues and giving up on the ideology. I would argue that the revolution, the Egyptian revolution, actually destroyed the spiritual argument and what one may call the soft power of Iran. Iran remains today in the camp of the authoritarian regimes, and the regime has no achievements to present. I would just point to some of the problems. Economically, Iran is a country 160 among 170 in the world in terms of economic freedom. The problems with economic freedom is connected to the ideology and to the regime structure. It has severe influence on the economy, of course, but also on the development of science, big influence on pollution, prostitution. A lot of social problems emanate from this ideology. So the regime needs to use hard power, both inside and outside. The main argument of the regime, and this is something that they really try hard to convince right now the people, that they are leading a universal revolution, that the Iranian model is the perfect model. But as time goes by, it looks less and less like that, and this is a very big problem. We've seen it first in the wave of WikiLeaks, that Iran is unpopular among the leaders of the Middle East. Now we see in the wave of revolution that Iran is unpopular or really irrelevant to the rest of the Middle East. There were signs to this for quite some time in Iraq. I'm also a member in the Iraq group, and I did research about the Iranian influence in Iraq. I think Iran missed fantastic opportunity in Iraq with 60% Shiites to become really a good brother, a friendly brother, and a helping hand to Iraq. They just missed it. They have a lot of influence in Iraq, no doubt. They have some economic influence, but let's say Turkey has much more economic clout in Iraq, and the Turks are not hated. They are liked. They don't do all these tricks, and they provide a much better model. So Iran is in big trouble there. Of course, in Syria they have some economic influence, but what we see in Hezbollah, Hamas, and so on is sheer rude power. Hard power, either they bribe or they assassinate or they provide missiles. This is not the utopian idealism of this revolution that actually I believe that it could have provided a good alternative to Western materialism and consumerism. And we have to wait and see whether this will occur one day. Also, what we see in recent years is that the West is not that materialistic as people argued, and this also has impact on Iran. First of all, the Americans and the Israelis, by the way, proved that they are able to sacrifice lives also. So they are not materialistic. The Americans went into Iraq. They definitely did not win the war spectacularly, but they didn't run away. This was not Mogadishu or Beirut. They stayed their course, and this means that the spiritual dimension of radical Islam in general and of Khomeinism in particular, in suicide bombing, is just irrelevant. Everyone sacrifices, and also the West, they can sacrifice their children as well. And also the West proved itself as very serious when it comes to democracy. Iran is facing really hard time now to explain, to try to convince people that that there are all kinds of schemes by America that started these revolutions and so on. Part of it is probably correct, but generally speaking, there are much better examples, as I said, Turkey, and also there will be possibly other better examples, such in Egypt, and this will form a major problem. So, what are the solutions? Am I okay? Okay. What are the solutions from the point of view of the Iranians? First of all, we have the solutions of the reformists of the Khatami 1997 to 1999, let's say, and now the Green Movement. I think this is what most Iranians would like to see. They would like to see the regime staying, but changing dramatically in terms of style and openness. Whether this will happen, I don't know. Right now, it seems that the regime is pretty powerful, but there are a lot of divisions within the regime. We'll go to a little prediction. From the point of view of the regime, we've seen in recent years a number of alternative or, let's say, other discourses. One of them is the Mahdist discourse that started really very vigorously with the ascent of Ahmadinejad. I call it GMR, the Great Mahdi Revolution. This is a discourse that anticipates pretty much a kind of eschatological millenarian solution coming very soon, and is tightly connected to the technological and nuclear project. We are preparing an army because the Mahdi is about to come, and every big change, even to the worse, we heard also from Ahmadinejad recently, you know, we are expecting a big change, look at this big change. Whenever they speak about big change, it rings like something, you know, millenarian. There is some kind of scenario there. Then another dimension that was researched by David Chan, who just finished an MA thesis recently, is the intensive use of Iranian imperialist Persian discourse, and presenting Iran as a superpower per se, that is also connected to Shi'ism in many ways. Cyrus was a prophet, non-prophet, Dhul-Qarnayn, all this story. Recently, Ahmadinejad argued that pretty soon we are looking forward to have 7 billion people in the world learning Persian, because Iran is going to be the next leader of the world. Of course, this is also connected to scenarios of the Mahdi, apocalyptic scenarios in which the Mahdi will come from the east, the Persians would become the leaders of Islam, and so on. There are also many efforts to appropriate the revolutions in the Arab world, presenting them as continuations of the Islamic revolutions of Iran, and as a fulfillment of the predictions of Khomeini and the vision that the Muslim peoples of the world would unite. There will be Islamic revolutions. You know that the supreme leader of Iran has no Iran in his title. He is the supreme leader of the holy regime, the supreme leader of the Islamic revolution, and actually Wali Ahd Muslimin Jahan, meaning he is the leader or the caretaker of all the Muslims in the world. So Iran is just one revolution among many. Also, they really enjoy and put a lot of emphasis on the troubles that others experience, and this is a kind of lesson for the population. And this is an all the Iranian tradition. Whenever there were a lot of problems in Iraq, this was a signal to the population. You know, if you change things, look what can happen. So let's say Egypt and Tunisia were very bad news for Iran, but Libya is not so bad. They deal a lot they focus a lot on Bahrain and so on. Gaddafi is really doing a very good job for the Iranian government by showing that if you go to a revolution, it can end very, very badly. So where are we heading? Eli Podeh warned us not to predict, but I like to do that, and you know, it doesn't mean that it's always correct, but you know, we try our best. So first of all, there is still within the regime strong commitment to the Velayat Faqih regime. Velayat Faqih regime, meaning the authoritarian regime that is led by the supreme leader. The Green Movement is facing difficulties. However, this doesn't mean that they are over with. I would say that what we've seen recently with Rafsanjani being let out of the assembly of experts suggests that the regime is still very fearful. The assembly of experts has the power to announce the supreme leader as incapable, and this means that there is at least a scenario in which millions of people will go out to the streets, the army would start shooting, and then the assembly of experts can ask the supreme leader to resign. I think this was one of the reasons that he was that he would just ask to leave. Now, I do believe that a change will come in Iran, but it's really very hard to predict, and actually impossible to predict how fast this will happen and what way will it take. The current Shiite authoritarian millenarian system is difficult for Iran. They pay very high, very steep price for that. So a change will come, and it's really hard to see, you know, to give a real, you know, a better prediction. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pardo. I think we've heard three very interesting perspectives on the topic of this session, Sunni-Shi'a relations. And if there are any questions, then please go ahead. Yes, please.
The title of the session was Sunni-Shi'a relations. I would like maybe to expand it to something related to it, intra-Shia relations. I think Ronen mentioned Ali Sistani. And it's interesting to know what is his role, because he's a very important, although he's Persian, but a very large influence vis-a-vis Ali Khamenei with the Wilayat al-Faqih. What is his position, to what extent he influences the infrastructure, the Shia infrastructure in Iraq. Another thing, Eldad, you mentioned that the Iranian influence in Iraq is not so big. The model is Turkey, which surprises me, because after all, I mean, it's not only economics, and it's also Shi'ism. So maybe some elaboration. And to what extent there is this tendency in Iraq to consolidate the ethnic Shia Arab trends. After all, the centers of Shi'ism are in Iraq, Najaf, Karbala. So there is probably this trend to withstand the pressure of the influence. And then, obvious question to Noga and to others, what happened in Iraq now with all these upheavals in the Middle East? What really happened? Thank you.
Okay, so I understand the question is basically addressed to the three lecturers. So what? Sure.
Everybody has his role.
Okay, so why don't we take it in turn? So Eldad, would you like to start? Would you like to stand there? Or? Okay.
Okay, first of all, Ali Sistani, I will leave Ali Sistani, the Iraq, for our more. It is Ali Sistani is no doubt the most prominent Shiite leader of the day. Interestingly enough, they did a research. You know, every every pilgrim, Shia pilgrim that goes to Mecca takes with him a little booklet. And there are differences in the booklets. There is the Sistani booklet and other booklets. Turns out that Revolutionary Guards and Basiji and all these people, most of them take Sistani's booklets. And this connects to other indication that within the Revolutionary Guards, it is still not known to what extent these guards are loyal to the principle of Wilayat al-Faqih. One can see also when it comes to the demonstrations in Iran that the regime brings the Revolutionary Guards only as last resort. They prefer the police, they preferred all kinds of thugs and Basiji people. The Revolutionary Guards particularly don't like Ahmadinejad because of his role in the war and so on. So, and also Ali Sistani, he supported the democratic process in Iraq. I think personally that he is one of the greatest people in the world today. I mean, he should get the Nobel Prize, not Obama. He did his voice is extremely important, and for peace and also for spirituality, and he is much more capable to bring many Sunnis into Shi'ism. Unlike Iran, that only antagonizes everyone. Now, I'm not saying that Iran has no influence in Iraq. It has a lot of influence, but this influence, I really follow Joseph Nye's soft power, hard power paradigm. I think it's very helpful. Soft power means that people like you and help you because they like you or appreciate what you are doing. Hard power means either they are afraid of you because you have the weapons, or you bribe them, you give them something. And Iran needs to pay for everything, or to assassinate or to bribe. And it's easy for them. They have a lot of networks. They work very shrewdly, and they have a lot of influence in Iraq, no doubt about it. But they are unpopular, and they could have been very popular had they not played such a pernicious role during the civil war.
Sistani indeed is a very important personality. Is also the ambiguity I was talking about, because even such a personality who is Taifiyya per se, a Persian, a sectarian religious leader, will avoid using Taifi terms in his discourse, and he would condemn Taifiyya. He's being condemned by the opponents of Taifiyya, as we saw here, because of the fact that he is not an Iraqi citizen, and he's absolutely involved in Iraqi politics. He's behind many of the key decisions, the turning decisions in the formation of contemporary Iraq. We will not forget his role in drafting or crafting the election, general election according to the one man, one vote rule. But the fact is that he's not getting any younger. And one cannot really know what would be the face of the Hausa after he passes away. He was a person who could transform himself from being a docile cleric under Saddam to being one of the moving spirits behind the change in Iraq after 2003. But one cannot really know what would the Hausa look like after he passes away.
Okay, two answers. First of all, concerning Sistani, it's important to note that Sistani actually brought democracy to Iraq. He told Bremer, I'm an Irani, you are an American. He didn't tell him, one of his aides told him, I'm an Irani, you're an American, let the Iraqi people decide. He stayed out of politics the past few tense months of coalition talk, and he didn't intervene and didn't support one side or the other, or Nuri al-Maliki or whatever other contender. He was, so here is an important point, because democracy will bring the Shi'i majority to power. So this was his main point, and I think we can't ignore the sectarian side of it. But he didn't put his weight behind any of them. He was involved. he supported a pact with America. It was the only way to get them out legally. And to a large extent, it was his helpers that helped Nuri al-Maliki to reach such an agreement. Concerning the new generation in Iraq, and of course we do see protests in Iraq in our Tahrir Square, and I think it's very interesting to compare again Nuri Said and Nuri al-Maliki, or the generation, I don't like this term, but what is usually called the Effendiya generation, and Tahrir Square generation of today, the influence from Egypt, the social and political grievances. People in Iraq do not have homes, they do not have electricity, water, many refugees, many IDPs, and many people are feeling that they were left behind. In, I think, the 25th of last month, yeah, they had a day of rage. Why rage? Because they were angry at the result of the elections and at what the leaders are doing now or not doing. So we do see it, and I think it's history teaches that we must follow this generation, because we have a very similar situation to what we saw under the monarchy. Thanks.
Thank you. Any more questions, please? Yes.
Thank you for 3 very interesting talks. My question is for Ronen, and it concerns sectarianism in the region, because you're speaking about sectarianism in Iraq, but it's a regional issue. And I was wondering, you mentioned that some of these novels are published in Beirut. Is it the case that Iraqis look to Lebanon and their experience with sectarianism? Because there's a lot to learn there, both good things and bad things. And the one thing I wanted to mention is that in Lebanon, there are proponents of sectarianism, a bit like you, I guess. People who point to the positives of sectarianism, as well as, of course, a lot of people who would point to the negatives. And Lebanon has a long experience with sectarianism as a system. So sectarianism is a fact, if you want. It is the way that society works. At the same time, people have this experience of having lived through a largely sectarian civil war. So people agree publicly that sectarianism is bad. And mostly when you speak publicly, you have to conform to this way of speaking about sectarianism. But at the same time, people live sectarian lives. They live mostly with people from their sect, and they have a lot of stereotypical ideas about people from other sects, and they conform to the system largely. So you have this strange sort of doubleness. And that's just sort of one experience from Lebanon. But I was wondering if you could sort of broaden it out and talk about sectarianism as a regional issue and how it interplays, I guess, with Iraq.
I expected this question. Thank you very much for asking this question. When the Iraqis were on their own intifada in 1991, which was quite reminiscent of the recent events in Libya, I must say, then on the 16th of March, today actually, 1991, or tomorrow, 16th of March, Saddam was on television for the first time, and he looked pretty much like Gaddafi on his first speech, in which he waved the green book. I mentioned this because Saddam was playing on the fears of the Iraqis at that time. He was facing a sectarian revolt, and he was threatening Iraqis with Labnanat el-Iraq, the Lebanonization of Iraq. And for those who couldn't really understand that, he said that they are going to divide Iraq into dweilat, statelets, And this was quite effective, because following that, well, he actually went on screen when the Republican Guard was crushing the Intifada already. So, since then, the Intifada was repressed, and Saddam was back in power until 2003. So Lebanon has this double meaning for the Iraqis, and they would not like to look like Lebanon. It so happened that after 2003, this was the one state in the Middle East that really resembled Lebanon, Iraq, and it has, but maybe because there are some similarities which the Iraqis choose to ignore all the time. This is, and then we have to go back to the word ambiguity or doubleness, as you said. This doubleness, I mean, how can you live with such a doubleness? It is politically correct to speak against Taifiyya, but then most people live a Taifi life. You know, they live a Taifi, except some people who are out. They live a Taifi life, and there is a whole range of things that are Taifi, absolutely Taifi. So how can you put your hand in the sand and say that it doesn't really exist and doesn't really count for anything? Now, the fact that both books were published in Beirut is just because, you know, it's kind of it used to be kind of difficult to publish books in Baghdad, and these guys live out of Iraq, and since the 90s it has become common for Iraqi writers to publish in the best publishing houses in the Arab world, which happen to be in Beirut. So that's...
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for this morning, and so thank again our speakers. Okay, if it's brief, yes, go ahead, please.
I have one question about the messianic discourse, messianic ideology in Mahdi army in Iraq today, vis-à-vis of your topic, sectarism, positive and negative discourse of Iraq today.
Who would like to take Eldad?
Well, this is a large topic, and there is a lot of discourse in Iranian websites. Definitely among the Revolutionary Guards, we hear a lot of it. There is still no real thorough research to tell us exactly what kind of Mahdism it would be. We hear voices about Hojatiyya, but it's probably not that. And also it's very hard to discern whether it's manipulative or to what extent is it genuine. There is a professor by the name of Ahmad Fardid who was an expert on Martin Heidegger, who also developed this and educated the Revolutionary Guard. So this is a kind of an enigma, but there are a lot of debates, and there is also this profession of Mahdology in Iraq, Mahdi Shenasi, and there are people who know what they are talking about, those who don't know what they are talking about. We heard all the story of Ahmadinejad and the Jam Karan mosque and so on, so it's a big issue. In Iran. You speak about Iraq? Iraq, we have Muqtada Sadr, basically, that speaks a lot about the Mahdi movement, but it's not that
This is time to mention Muqtada Sadr, who has not been mentioned so far. And he's an ardent Mahdist. What else would you like to know? I mean, he uses the terminology of Mahdist ideology. But not only this terminology. It's a mistake to speak to see him only through the eyes of Mahdist terminology, because Muqtada Sadr is also pretty much on the streets. He was there before those demonstrators in Tahrir Square would discover the streets. He's using the terms of Iraqi patriotism and nationalism quite effectively. He was the only, his deputies in parliament were the only ones who noisily opposed the approval of the SOFA agreement with the Americans. There are lots of other contents except Mahdi's ideology to Muqtada Sadr and Muqtada Sadr's phenomena. I don't think we have seen the last of him. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and we'll break up, we'll reconvene at noon. Thank you.
I think we can say good afternoon. We are after midday. Good afternoon. And it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Mr. Dan Meridor, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intelligence and Atomic Energy, also a member of the Inner Cabinet. And of course, in this kind of conference, we expect from him to hear his evaluation about the topic of our conference, the Middle East in transition. Until now, we had academics which talk about it. Now we have the real thing, to hear what, especially what his views, against the background what's going on, what we hear about the perceptions in the cabinet. I hope he will tell us more than enough, but the cabinet, as far as we know from the press, is more two schools of thought, basically. One is status quo, wait and see what's going to happen. Maybe it's a kind of excuse to continue the status quo. And then another one, and I think Dan is subscribed to it, to enhance the peace process. If I'm correct, especially with the Palestinians, what Israel has to do. And again, here again, you have these two perceptions. One is far-fetched, not in the cabinet, a comprehensive settlement. But others speak about short-term or interim settlement with the Palestinians, Palestinian state, 50% of this was a new idea of Netanyahu, although in Bar Ilan, I don't know why you spoke in Bar Ilan, not here, but still, in Bar Ilan he said that two-state solution, he spoke about a Palestinian state in 1 year and so on and so forth. Then he changed his mind. Why and what should we do about this? And incidentally, you know, this 50% is in the roadmap. I mean, more or less a Palestinian state in provisional boundaries. This was the roadmap, which was supposed to be completed in 2003. Now we are 2011, but it shouldn't surprise you. In the Middle East, things are late all the time. Middle East time, things are late. The PLO adopted Resolution 181, the partition resolution, 41 years later, 1988. Some of our leaders discovered the Palestinian people also decades later. This was not done, and here this is my opportunity to give you Dan Meridor. Please. You can. Yeah.
Boker Tov. I understand we speak in English today, so let me speak not for the cabinet, not for the government, not for the inner cabinet. Let me speak what I think. So don't read too much to what I'm going to say in terms of the Israeli position, if there is one, or the Israeli resentment or acceptance of any idea. Let me see how I look at the topic that is on the agenda here. Transition is the term that was chosen here. I think that one of the most important characteristics of our era is the accelerated pace of changes in our life. It is not only in the Middle East, it's not only in the question of politics or policies of peace and war. It is much broader than that. And it's in a pace that I think has never been seen in human history. If I had spoken in this audience, say, 30 years ago, no one of you would have had a computer at home. The word Google would sound very strange to you. We still had Encyclopedia Britannica or Encyclopedia Ivrit, all those strange creatures of the past. The world has changed immensely in recent years. You can call it the era of globalization, the era of modern technology, high-tech. Borders mean much less than ever in the past. They don't stop. They do not block ideas or people or materials. People have much more power than ever in the past. Human beings, individuals, countries sometimes are much less powerful. I think that in the book before last of Tom Friedman that described globalization, a book termed the Lexus and the Olive Tree. Lexus car, the Japanese car, and the olive tree representing the environment of my own culture. He coins a term, super empowered individual. Individuals are much more powerful than ever in the past. He looks upon it very, very positively. He was very happy about this, and of course we should be very satisfied that people can do much more. People know much more. Nobody controls information. You don't need to go even to Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge or La Sorbonne for understanding, for knowing you can sit on an island in Indonesia and click the right click and you know everything. Nobody can control this. Technology in the hands of people, not in the hands of government. Money you can have and buy, when you sit in Paris, you can buy with Brazilian currency assets in Thailand. People are very powerful and countries are less powerful. This is a major shift. In a way, in the realm of ideas, in the realm of the war of ideas, of the clash of civilizations, or whatever term is given here, we see again something very, very new. If one looks at it from many regimes in the Middle East, conservative regimes of the Muslim countries, of the Arab countries, one could say that there was here an invasion of ideas from the West that penetrated all walls and reached every tent in Saudi Arabia and every house in Algeria or in Yemen. All of a sudden, people who live in Saudi Arabia, women who live in Saudi Arabia, could see other women driving cars. Who could have thought of this? Or the language, the terms of liberties, freedoms, centrality of people, democracy in all its aspects. All this has penetrated the world that may not know how to deal with that. And there was a reaction against this invasion of the Western ideas, defending the old culture where women should know their place, and men have their place, and the legitimacy of the regime doesn't come from voting, it comes from somewhere else. Well, this is a very interesting development, and it created, and we still see, and we will see, many developments that have to do with that. It created a new competition of ideas, and I think I'll come to that. We see part of that around us now. In a way, I think the world order that we know may not stay intact. Influences are seen, even in terms of world order. What is allowed, what is not allowed, who are the players. The fact that we see in some of those societies, not only in the Arab world, I think in many other countries as well, a return of religious politics is quite interesting and for me alarming. One could have thought that after the era of enlightenment in Europe, 18th century and over, God would be limited to how you go to synagogue or church or mosque, and people will not do politics under God and for God. Europe itself had paid a very heavy price for many years of religious wars, Protestants and Catholics, Jews definitely, crusades against Islam, and you don't see a return of God to politics in Europe. But there's one country you might have heard of where there's a very important evangelist movement now, not an Arab country. Evangelists became very important, much more so than ever in the past. In some remote part of the Jewish world, you see people speaking in the name of God in the political world. In the extreme case, there was one man who killed our prime minister because he thought this is the religious commandment, the way he interpreted it. In the Muslim world, you see the return of God in many countries, return of religious politics. If you combine the first thing I spoke of, the empowerment of people and the weakening of states, and you add this to the religious development I spoke of, you see new organizations that are not nationally based but religiously based mushrooming all over the Muslim world. You can call them Taliban, you can call them Al-Qaeda, or Jihad, or Hamas, or Hezbollah. Some of them have some national colors to them, some of them are cross borders. And in some researchers that I heard of, people who identify themselves as Arabs, or particularly, say, Lebanese, Jordanian, Iraqi, would now first say, we are Muslims, and then comes the second identity. How far is it going? Is it one-way street, or will it go back? It's all still open, but we see this happening, and the religious element here threatens the present regime, the present regimes in Arab countries. Of course, Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas introduced this religious layer to the Arab-Israeli conflict in a way that has never been done in the past. Neither Nasser in his days of pan-Arab attitude nor any particular Arab country ever brought Allah into the war. And when Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas say it is not a political issue, it's against religion that there will be a non-Muslim state here, they introduce a new element, which is very different and has different characteristics and may need a different treatment than the traditional historical international between nations war that we had here. So this return to or appeal to religious solutions is something that we are seeing for the last decades spreading. What are people more? Are they more Iraqis or are they more Sunni or Shiites? When you ask them in Iraq, what are you? What will the answer be? It was national in the days of Arab nationalism and particular nationalism under Saddam Hussein, if you like. We do see a Shiite Sunni element of the war in Bahrain these days when the Saudis send their army to help the Sunnis against the Shias or against an Iranian influence just these days, something unprecedented. Saudi army going to Bahrain. So there are things that are not just political, they go deeper into culture and attitudes to life that we see changing around us. Now, among these things, we see the influence of the Western ideas, democratic ideas that do stem from the West, come from the West, that were born and bred and developed in the West, into the Muslim world and the Arab world around us. As I said, they enter not because the regime wants it, but because the regime can't stop it. And people look at whether it's Al Jazeera or CNN, and they read and they see on television not just philosophical theses, but they see life in a different way. They see different questions that are asked, different debates that are debated. They see that in other countries people can make a change, which they have never felt in their own society. When I take all this as a background and I look at what happened in Egypt a few weeks ago, the first thing I want to say is something about ourselves. It's like me personally, but all of us here. I think the first lesson is the humility. We don't know enough. We think we know a lot. We all are, including myself, intelligent people here. The intelligence community, Israeli, American, European, is good intelligence. We know a lot. And I think all of us, and I speak of myself, if I were asked a day before it happened in Egypt, I would tell you no way. It did happen, taken all of us by surprise. I have to add that the second surprise was that I would not have imagined and did happen is the American reaction to what happened, but this is a different story. So it is hard for us to acknowledge that we don't know enough, because people want to know in order to plan the future and to know what is right and wrong, what they should do, what they should not do, and I think we don't know enough. We know a lot. In many cases we can predict what will happen. We can say with some certainty or high degree of probability what tomorrow will look like, but sometimes things happen that in retrospect, post factum, we can analyze and say it should have happened, of course, but it's not very honest to say so. Of course, I think that if somebody can say to me, a regime like this can never persist, a day will come when the people will revolt against it, of course, how can dictatorship persist? It sounds very logical, only it's not true. If somebody would have said to you, say in January of 1918, that this revolution that took place in Russia 3 months ago cannot persist, it's so much against human nature, people cannot live like that, they would be right. Only it took about 70 years until it materialized. So we don't know enough, and all that we say about the changes around us, all that we say is burdened with the high weight of uncertainty. And I say what I say now in a world that I know is much less certain, developments that are very uncertain, and we can analyze, we can speak, and it's good to speak and to hear, and we need to have an open mind. It's a changing world, and sometimes it's difficult to analyze the changes. And it's dangerous, I have to say, because, you know, people have a tendency to think that what was will continue. Moshe haya hu sheyeh, says Kohelet ben David Melech al Yerushalayim. What was will persevere. This is what we think the future holds for us. You see it, by the way, in military organizations. The more prestigious the organization is, the bigger it is, the harder it is for this organization to adapt to the new realities, which is why it was such futile bravery with which the Polish cavalry fought the German tanks when they conquered, I think 2 weeks it took them to reach Warsaw in 1939. Because they know the war of the past. They know that the horses, the cavalry protects Poland. All this history tells us this. Against Russians, against Germans, against Swedes, against Lithuanians, Ukrainians who didn't conquer Poland one time or another. So this is what they prepared for. To understand that something is changing is difficult. But it's very important, and I say, on top of being important, it's very difficult. So we live with some uncertainty, and I say it as something that accompanies me more now than ever in the past because of the changes that we are still witnessing these very days. What we saw in Egypt was very different from many other revolutions that took place in the Arab world, is this. First of all, the slogans that I heard or saw in the Tahrir Square, in the Liberation Square in Cairo, were not carved out from the Muslim vocabulary. They were not extreme at all. There was not Allahu Akbar, and not Itbah al-Yahud, and not done with America. They were all taken from the Western vocabulary. They were all, I mean, those that I saw. I never held a very good count, but I think that we had slogans there with which most of us can identify. It's liberties and freedoms and democracy and justice and equality. This all comes from our world. This is a different story. I don't remember something like this in the past in the Arab world. Second, against the image of violent Arab mob, we saw here non-violent demonstration. 2.5 weeks with no violence. If there was some violence, it was the government or the government-influenced people who, for a day or two, used some violent strategy or tactics. But it was not the violent Arab that we so easily speak about. It was very non-violent. It's a second interesting feature that we have seen developing there. And then it is not a revolution that was carried out by a group of officers in the army like Naguib and Nasser in 1952 against King Farouk. It was not a revolution taken by a party or by a religious sect. No, it was initiated by people. Those, if you like, super empowered individuals that Tom Friedman speaks of, the people who all of a sudden felt that they have power to effect changes in the political world, that they make a difference. They can do it. And they did it. In 2.5 weeks, they reached a point in which Mubarak left and his regime in the way left. Not more than that. I would say something about that. But this is a huge success for these people. I think this is what they wanted. And all this, of course, is seen all over the Muslim world. And I think that many people, simple people, intelligent people in this case, I think middle class, upper middle class, the way they looked at the square, can think, yes, we can make a difference. We can create a change in our own society. And this is what we saw earlier in Tunisia, which led Ben Ali to leave in no time, in a hurry. And this is what we see in a different development in Libya. This is what we see in Bahrain, and this is what we see in many countries all over the Muslim and the Arab world, not coming from organized groups, not coming from the old establishments, coming from people who feel, because this is what they see in the new world that we live in, that they can do things, and then the government may not be able to do much against them, or at least it has to cope with a new threat to the regime. This is a report of what we are seeing now. But no doubt we are just at the, to take from a different context something that Churchill once said, this may be the end of the beginning, not more than that. Where is it going to lead? In some days there's going to be a referendum in Egypt, I think on the 19th, of some changes in the constitution, amendments. If it passes, I don't know, they may have, should have elections, presidential and parliamentary, not clear in what order. When will this happen? Is it good to have it now, soon? Some people say the only organized groups are the ruling party of the past and the Muslim Brotherhood. Those young people don't yet have a power to organize, so they need more time. If they wait more time, longer, will the army still be ready and willing to give it away? All this is still an enigma. We don't know where it's going to go. So you've seen the beginning of a process, not more than that. We don't know where it is going to lead. And we see the whole Arab world around us going through new movements in the society, and we don't know where it is going to lead yet. From the Israeli perspective, no doubt the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, initiated in 1977 by Sadat and Begin, and then signed in 1979. This agreement has been the cornerstone of the peace efforts, the cornerstone of stability, the cornerstone of the Western American policy in the Middle East. And it is the role of Egypt that was traditionally the leader of the Arab world that was so essential in the influence that this agreement has all over the Arab world. For us, of course, it broke the Arab unity of animosity and belligerency that we had to cope with. It created a new world. We thought it's part of our life, it's part of something that can never be changed. This is it. So far, the people in power in Egypt have not said anything in a different direction. They all say that they will keep the agreement. I think it is not only because it's nice to keep agreements. As they say in Latin, pacta sunt servanda, agreements are to be kept. It is, I think, the interest of Egypt objectively. It is not the interest of Egypt to go to war or to join the militant camp. It is the interest of Egypt to refrain from that and to keep this agreement, not only because many countries in the world will not tolerate it, but I think basically they have no interest in fighting with us. So this seems to be okay now under the proviso I said earlier. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but this is what we see now. How will this develop in the election campaign in Egypt? Will the Muslim Brotherhood be playing it as they do now, as a harmless cat, pet at home? Will then later, if they win, if they get very powerful, show a different face to the world? Still an open question. So for our cause, the Israeli cause, of course, the Israeli-Egyptian treaty is very important. It is not just the treaty as such, it's the military annex of the treaty that is kept. It is the cooperation that we had against common enemies. Don't forget that Egypt was the major, the axis around which the Americans gathered the Arabs for the fight with the extremes like Iran and Syria. What does it do in the inter-Arab relationship? What does it do to the Palestinians? Let me say, and this is somewhat, what should I say, skeptical look at things. In the Palestinian camp, there's a big fight, a big struggle between the PLO, Fatah and the PLO on one hand, and Hamas on the other hand. Hamas was supported and is supported by Syria, somewhat by Iran. The PLO was supported by Egypt. Egypt weakened. I don't want to say harsher terms. What does it do in the equilibrium between Hamas and the PLO? Are they powerful enough to do something when they lost this backing, if they lost it? Not only because Egypt may change, not only because Egypt legitimized the Muslim Brotherhood, who are the twin organization with the Hamas, but because in the Arab world, Egypt doesn't seem to be as powerfully leading as before. So what does it do to the peace process? It's a good question if the PLO is weakening and Hamas is gaining power, which seems to be the case at 12:30. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but this is something we need to look at. It has implication and impact not only on Egypt itself. Let me go from here. So I would say the Arab world is changing. The reaction of many people when you see such changes, such turmoil, such earthquake, well, we shouldn't speak of an earthquake these days with Japan, but metaphorically, people's tendency is usually to stand still, not do anything, and see and wait for things to settle down. I don't think it's good policy for us now, and I'll say why in a minute. But I think that things are changing in the Arab world. You see the attitude of the regimes to their own people. They try to preempt what may happen. You see the actions taken by changing governments, firing people, reforms offered, even in Syria and other places. They don't know what Omar Slimani and Mubarak didn't know. And they don't know that it may or may not happen. So there is a preemptive attitude in many countries. So we don't know how it is going to develop. Let me say about Syria, before I go back to the Palestinians. President Assad of Syria gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal on the 31st of January, 18 pages of an interview, which is, I think, if you're interested, I think it's quite teaching. It's quite interesting to read. I don't want to go into the contents of this interview, but the very fact that the leader of a country gives 18 pages interview to the Wall Street Journal says he turns to the West, to America, maybe to Israel. It's interesting to note and see if we can make something of it in terms of the Israeli-Syrian dialogue or not. It is not to Iran that he speaks. It's not in Iranian he gives this interview. It's in English. I think it's his own English. I don't think it's translated. It's interesting to note. On the Palestinian track, let me say something about that in again, a broader perspective. When I speak about struggle and military struggle and power struggle, a new power has developed in recent years. President Obama called it soft power. And I think some of our adversaries or enemies use it quite efficiently. The understanding that the limit to power has been shown and is being shown in recent conflicts. America showed its power invading and occupying Iraq, occupying Afghanistan. It created shock and awe, to take an American expression. The second reaction is, oh, that's all you can do? All right, now we know the limit of your force as well. There's something that force cannot do. It's something that is very interesting and important to understand, but you see it all over the world. Israel had two conflicts, military conflicts, with Hezbollah in 2006, with Hamas in Gaza in 2009. No doubt, by every account, Israel is 10 times, 100 times stronger. The results were not 100-0 or 10-0. The result was more closer to a draw than to a victory of one side. There's a limit to what power can do. I go from this to what we see, to some players who understood that the soft power becomes sometimes more powerful than the raw power. Well, Mahatma Gandhi in India showed it 60-something years ago. See what happened recently in certain elements. Abu Mazen and the Palestinians, I'll speak of immediately in that context. Think of the Turkish flotilla as one other show of this soft power approach, not sending a ship with guns or with bombs, but sending a ship that looks very benevolent, very unarmed, speaking slogans and shouting words, and now you have to attack us. Let's see what you do with that. And think of the people in Tahrir Square. They didn't use weapons for revolution. They used soft power. So the use of soft power, of having no weapons making you stronger than those who have weapons, is a new paradigm that takes different forms, but you see it happening. I come from this to the Palestinians. I think the Palestinians have changed their policy or their strategy in a very interesting way. I think there are three elements in the new strategy that they adopted in recent years. One of them is no terror. The second is the build-up of a state bottom-up. Fayyad says he copied it from Ben Gurion in the Medina Shebaderech, a state in building. And the third, which is less positive, is that they would prefer pressure on Israel to negotiation with Israel. Political pressure, political imposition, if you like, and not negotiations, sitting in a room and having an agreed solution. The first is no terror. It's hard to say this after what happened in Itamar 3 nights ago. An atrocious, heinous crime that was committed by somebody or somebody's. I don't want to go into what exactly, who did it exactly, when things will be published and when people will know. But so I can't say don't think of it, because we all think of it and this was awful. But if you take the last 2 or 3 years, there was almost no terror. Not only because of us, of course, the Israeli army took years ago the defensive shield operation. The Israeli army and the security services are working very successfully there, but because of another element. There's a decision of Abu Mazen not to allow terror, and there's a cooperation between the security forces of the Palestinians and our security forces in unprecedented intimacy, very effectively, and there is no terror around. I remember the days when Sharon used to say, give me 1 week without terror. So we had 2 years and more with practically no terror. From the Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, I don't speak of Hamas, it's a different story. I remember that in 2001 or 2, when the Intifada of Arafat was hitting us day and night, killing about 1,000 Israelis, wounding many more, and you remember our life those days. I remember Abu Mazen then, number 2, saying that he's against the armed intifada. He's against using weapons in that intifada. It took some courage to say it when Arafat was alive. He did it, and when speaking with a friend of mine who's a general in our army, then he said, I'm against it because whenever we fight you on the streets, we'll lose. When we sit and talk with you, we have much better chances. So for him, it was not something new. He had the strategy of not going for violence because he thinks it doesn't help him. I don't think it's only or at all a moral issue. It's a very practical issue. And the fact that there's no terror removed the curtain of terror that was hanging on the reality that you can call occupation, administered territories, whatever you like, and people see it, and this is a major shift in their position in the world and in their policy. So first is no terror. It is the use of soft power rather than tough power, or hard power, or cruel power, or whatever adjective you want to add is okay here. The second, as I said, is build-up of the state from bottom, from the basis upwards. Now, this is not a declared policy of the PLO. This is mainly the action of Salam Fayyad, who does it. And if you walk around the territories in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, you see that the economy is booming in a way. They had, I think, 8 or 9% growth last year. They expect more this year. I hear from people who walk there that you see projects being carried out. You see people employed in much higher percentage. You see a new elite being developed in and ruling in Ramallah, which is built on business and different attitude. So economy is one thing. The second is law and order. There is much more law and order in the Palestinian territories now than ever in the past. Not good enough. It's not yet Israel. It's not yet Europe. But it's better than the past in terms of robbers and rapers and murders in the streets and thieves. It's much better. Then there is more institutions building that he's going for. And you see this tendency of building up the institutions and the reality so that they say we could show that we are ready for a state. We're building the state. This is the second element in which they are helped by us and by the world. In many ways, economically, Tony Blair is spending a lot of time on that. Third element, as I said, is more troubling. This is the replacement of negotiations as a means to get a solution to pressure on Israel. Now, people can say, and maybe it has some truth in it, that they would do both, negotiation and pressure. It's not mutually exclusive, but what we see now is mainly the pressure. And one needs to say this, and we hate to say it because it's a writing on the wall that we don't like to read because it's against our best wishes. There were 2 offers made to the Palestinian leadership that were very far-reaching, unprecedented in their time. One by Ehud Barak at Camp David 11 years ago in July of 2000. I happened to be there with him. And it was rejected by Arafat to a point where Clinton, who was the arbiter, if you like, the President of the United States, then said openly something that people usually in his position don't say: this side is to blame, Arafat, you're to blame, you didn't respond positively to something that was unprecedented. Then the Intifada broke out, you remember the rest of it. Another offer was given to Abu Mazen by Olmert, the previous Prime Minister of Israel. Now, there are all sorts of stories about it, we read it in the press, we hear of it, but definitely if you think of it from Abu Mazen's point of view, he is offered, the way it's recounted by Olmert and by others, a Palestinian state, end of occupation, of course. He's offered practically 100% of the land with some 6% swap, but all the land in terms of quantity that he wanted. He's offered a solution of Jerusalem that nobody ever thought of, like internationalization of the Holy Basin, that since the 1947-48 resolution of the UN, nobody spoke of that. Something symbolic about refugees, and he did not grab it. Now think of a person who dedicated all his life, if it is true, to build a Palestinian state, and he has it, and he says, let me check it, I'll come back to you tomorrow. The morning after, the way it's told to us, Saeb Barikat, the Jericho guy, called and said, we made a mistake, we're in Amman today, and they disappeared ever since. Is it because basically the PLO has never been, as we know, about the territories? It has been about Israel. It was built before there were territories. It was built in 1965. And they cannot legitimize Israel, which was part of the deal, or that they are ready to legitimize Israel, but they want the right of return, which, of course, is almost the same as saying Israel will not exist in the end and the continued struggle will be the return issue? Or is it that he wants to do it, but he didn't forget what most people in the West try to forget, that there is Hamas somewhere there. Not only Hamas taking Gaza away from him in 2005, by the way, winning election, and then taking Gaza away, but Hamas challenging what Israel accepted in the Oslo Agreement, that the PLO is the sole representative of the Palestinian people. It's not Gaza. It's a question of who speaks for the cause, who can give up, if anybody wants to, the idea of return, who speaks for the exile, for diaspora. Hamas says, you could have heard, I saw Khaled Mashal saying it on television from Damascus, you cannot speak for the Palestinians, we do that. So I need to say that the lack of readiness to speak with us and negotiate may stem from the thinking that we will not give up enough. Olmert did not give up enough. If that's what he thinks, then I don't know what he has in mind. Or the opposite, that he is afraid he will have to decide. And once he decides, it may be exposed that he is not powerful enough, because not only Gaza, but others will not accept it. Or that I'm wrong, and this is just tactics. But I leave it open. Don't overlook the fact that we had the test, and this is the result of the test, and it is not promising, unfortunately. So this we saw. Nowadays, they don't want to go to negotiations with us. This government has offered something no other government ever offered, and we practically did it. We suspended building constructions, not all construction, just for Jews. Arabs could go on constructing. We suspended this construction for Jews, for Israelis, for 10 months. No government ever, from 67 on, ever did this. And we thought, okay, now you have this excuse to come and talk. 9 months they didn't come. The 10th month they came and they had this photo op with Netanyahu. That was the end of it. Aren't they interested? They take a different approach. They go to countries one by one to try to extract from them recognition of a Palestinian state in the 67 lines. And they got it from some countries in South America. They want to get more. They aim at September this year at the UN General Assembly, where they want to have an imposition by the world. I don't think it will work. I think it's wrong. But let me say what I see troubling here, and why I suppose and suggest that we should have our own initiative, which I am calling for, not from yesterday, and it has nothing to do with the changes in the Arab world that we saw recently. I thought it is a different issue altogether. In recent years, there has begun to develop an understanding in parts of the world that the 67 lines will not be the end lines of the two states. Even Yossi Beilin and Yasser Bedrabo accepted in the Geneva Accord that the blocks of settlement, some of them will be part of Israel, and the new line will take into account these demographic changes. Then came the letter from the United States President Bush to Prime Minister Sharon saying this specifically, that the new borders that would be agreed between the two states, Israel and the Palestinian state, will be influenced by or impacted by, I don't remember the exact wording, population centers and demographic changes. This means the same thing. I could say that I remember at Camp David, it was clear to, nobody agreed to anything, but it was clear that where the Jewish or Israeli settlement is heavy and successful, and there's a big number, it will be part of Israel. It was, of course, the case about the Jewish neighborhoods of East Jerusalem and some other parts, like Ma'ale Adumim, Gush Etzion, other places, and so forth. Recently, they say no. They say 67 lines. This, I think, is dangerous. When the United Nations Security Council almost resolved, 15 countries spoke for, 14 countries voted for, 1 voted against, the idea that building across the 67 lines is illegitimate. That is to say that whoever builds in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem is doing something illegitimate, maybe illegal. That if we build a house in Shderot Eshkol, we build something illegal. This is almost a hostile act towards Israel, towards the history, and the reality of the Middle East. Everybody accepted already that this was going to be part of Israel. Going back to 67 lines is dangerous. I think that we should come up with an initiative. And I think that in the Palestinian context, I don't want to speak of other areas that should be included here. I think that it's unnatural and dangerous when one side has a very clear target. They know what they want. In terms of borders, they say 67 lines. And our side has no target, no objective. What are we fighting for? Suppose the Arab side says, okay, take what you want. What is it you want? You want the whole land to the Jordan River? Of course, in that case, give us rights. Do we end up with a Jewish state or do we end up with a binational state? The answer is, I think, obvious. Do you want a different border? What is it? Do you fight for Shechem, Nablus, as you fight for Ma'ale Edomim? I think we should make clear, at least in general terms, that we do not go for the whole lot. That we want to have the blocks of Jewish settlements or the fence line or something of that sort as the end result of the territorial story. So there will be two competing ideas, two competing goals, and then negotiations should start. I don't think it's good to continue with the blurred objective. It's bad for the Israelis. What are we fighting for? It's bad for the world who cannot agree to something unclear like that. And if you don't say anything and you build all over the area, it seems that your action shows that you want the whole area. This is something that is not tolerable and is not right, and I think we should say it clearly now. Even if we don't delineate the exact line, the principle of blocks, I think, should be said openly to the world. I think at the same time we should ask from them. Tell us, you, the Palestinians, this should be asked by the Americans and others, what is your proposal about refugees? We say no refugees to Israel. The whole idea of dividing a land that we think is all ours and you think is all yours is that every nation of the two will satisfy all its aspiration in its own land, not in the other guy's land. If you still think of cross-border return, tell us. I think if they will say, yes, we want, after we have a state, to have a right to send the people to live with you, then I think it will be made clear, even to our friends and enemies, what we are fighting for. I think we cannot bring it to the light because it's not clear what we say. I think we should say very clearly what we have in mind and then demand from them declaration on that issue of principle. And the same thing applies to security arrangement and Jerusalem. I think it's important that we do it. I think that if we do this, I think our position in the world will be better because now we are not going in a very promising way. And we saw the first signs in the Security Council. I want to sum up and say the following. Yes, we see a changing world, very much surprisingly changing, sometimes expectedly changing, but it's hard to predict, if not the trend, and even this is not clear, the pace and the chronology of things. It's hard to say. It's important, after all, to keep our power, our might, our strength, both militarily, politically, economically, in every other aspect. And I think we do it basically quite well. But part of our power is our political stand in the world. We are not in a steady state. We are in a state that clearly needs to change. We cannot leave things like that. I think that we should grab the opportunity that there is no terror. And there's a Palestinian leadership that says that they are committed to a change in the right direction and try to bring them, to induce them, to lure them into the negotiating table by, I think, saying we don't build anymore across the blocks line, not the 67 lines. We do build within the blocks, will be part of Israel, but not over the blocks. I think this is a policy that can be explained, even with our friends in the American Congress and some European countries. This could be understood. I think this is important that we have a goal so that if we focus all our efforts, political, international, money, economic, security, to the certain areas that could be added to Israel, but not over that, there's a chance that we'll succeed. I think it's important and I think it's good that we do it. And I hope that the government now and the Prime Minister who contemplates a speech or a plan will take all this into account. So we see the changes. We shouldn't stand still because we are not in a steady state. We should use it to see that we can help ourselves and maybe the world around us to proceed or to develop these changes into a better future and not to a more dangerous one. let me pause here. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Thank you. You want to collect the questions or one by one?
One by one.
Okay. Thanks very much for the insightful and intriguing talk, quite balanced. Maybe I'll start. You mentioned the trend of Islamism that doesn't recognize Israel. But also you mentioned some other trends, and I would have mentioned that only a few countries, I mean, only one regime, Iran, is anti-Israel. And of course, the organization, Hezbollah, Hamas, but most regimes are not so much. And here it leads me to a first question. I have more, but for the sake of time, the Saudi initiative, the Saudi Arab initiative, which was a kind of a breakthrough. Some people say tactics. Why Israel has not accepted it? Until now, I haven't heard a convincing argument why, even in principle, not accepted as it is, even in principle. Because as you know, the peace offered Israel peace, security, normal relations for a Palestinian state, West Bank, East Jerusalem as the capital, and the solution for the Palestinian issue, not Hakel Auda, not right of return, but 194, which is different.
Well, I think it's a very interesting question. First, on the first remark you made, I'm not hysterical. I think that many Arab regimes accept us in this area. Not only officially Jordan and Egypt in the peace treaty, and relationship we have developed with other countries like Morocco and Tunisia and many Gulf states. This was a major shift that took place along 30 and more years. Since 1970, since the Black September, I think there was a big change in the Arab world, not out of seeing the light, to take a Christian metaphor, but maybe out of realpolitik approach. We are strong enough, we'll stay here, and it's better to live with us rather than to try to get rid of us. And I think we saw Jordan first, informally, Egypt formally, then Jordan formally in 1994. We saw the Oslo Agreement in that direction, although I didn't think it was a good one, but it's in direction. We saw Syria coming to talk with us exactly 20 years ago in Madrid in 1991. We saw a development in that respect, and it's a good one. By the way, en passant, I would say if those regimes become democratic and masses will speak and people take their view into account, I don't know what this trend what will happen to this trend. Are the masses for Israel or against Israel? I don't know. I don't say I know and I hide it. I think it's an open question. I'm sure that had Sadat gone to a referendum before he did what he did, asking the people, should I recognize Israel, he would say, but would have about 90% against. As would Begin, if you would ask the Israeli people whether to give up Sharm el-Sheikh or peace, if you remember Dayan's approach.
They did.
Yeah, I think the referendum
80% were against.
Pardon?
80%, 77% were against giving Sinai.
Oh, yeah, okay. So I think that when you speak of democracy and leadership, there is some interplay here.
Yeah.
And after Begin did what he did, 90% supported him, or 80%. But before this, it was different. So I'm not sure what the people would say if people become more important, if the masses will speak, if it's good or bad for peace. But this is I'm saying it en passant. Your second question is more important. Now, let's say again my approach. I said it, by the way, when I was in government in 2002, and I would say it even today. The initiative that began with the prince, now king of Saudi Arabia, in an interview to Tom Friedman in 2002, and then was somewhat changed in Beirut somewhat later, I think is the best ever, most forthcoming ever Arab position towards the Israeli-Arab conflict. If you compare it to Khartoum of 1968, no recognition, no negotiation, no peace, and you compare it to what happened, developed through the 30-something years since then, and you see the approach saying, yes, recognition, peace, and coexistence, maybe even normalization, I'm not sure if the word is there. This, of course, is a major shift. It has to do with what I said earlier. I think many more Arab countries understood that we are here to stay for all sorts of reasons. And I said then, and I think I can say it now, I think the Arab Peace Initiative is the most advanced, most favorable presentation of the Arab position toward the Arab-Israeli conflict. However, and I should say this and add 2 or 3 more pages describing it in a very positive manner, but to take this as the basis, not as the Arab position, but as our position, raises some questions. The first one, of course, is the change that was introduced into this initiative from Riyadh or from New York, wherever the interview was given, to Beirut. When it came to Beirut, Arafat sent, I think, Nabil Sha'at to Beirut, said, don't ever sign it unless you introduce what you just mentioned, the haq al-auda, the right of return. And they found a formula that doesn't say right of return. It refers back to 194, to Resolution 194 of the United Nations, which leaves this question as a question that needs to be resolved, and the idea of return is there as an option. I don't want to go into the interpretation, but it's there, and I know of some important people in the Arab world who said this is the only way we could support it because it leaves this an open question. So I think that if we go to the table in a new conference with the Arab world, a new Madrid or a new something else, if they should come forth with their position, which I say is the most advanced of ever towards us, and we should say yes, but, and the but is no way there would be a right to return, a national right to go to that part of the land, which is now Israel, and this is out of the question for us. We Jews will have to limit our right to return to our land, so the Jews who want to come back will not be able to go to Shechem or Bethlehem or whatever city which will be in your hands, and you want to go to your homeland, you'll be in your homeland, but not in Ramleh, in Ramallah. This is something that needs to be made clear because it's not a theoretical issue. It may be that some people say it's only tactical, they say it and they will change. I don't know. I know that some of them take it seriously. I think it should be made very clear. So the Arab Peace Initiative, yes, but, and the but is this, and then the border should be negotiated. It's not a 67 line, it should be negotiated. It should not be far from that, obviously, and all this, I think, this should be said. It shouldn't be negative, it's positive, but not all the way.
Thanks. Yes, please, go ahead.
Whether the separation or sterilization of religion, yes, sterilization or separation of religion from politics can be useful for international peace and good cooperation.
Okay, of course, it's a philosophical question, historical question, and one needs to define religion, or one needs to define religion and politics. Religion, of course, part of human history, if you like, human culture for millennia, and it's very powerful. Many countries have many religious people in Jewish world, Muslim world, Christian world, and it is nothing negative or positive per se. The question becomes relevant when people take this religious authority as dictating a certain political result in terms of war and peace, in terms of borders, and this, I think, is very dangerous. People, when people fight or people have a quarrel, people have a difference, people have a conflict, they can sit down and compromise. Gods never compromise. God is truth by definition, or if you like, by nature, if there is something like this, the nature of God, whether it's Christian God or Jewish God or Muslim God. And this is why it is dangerous that politics is dominated by religion, at least in the field of international, between states. If religion tells you something that is a commandment, you cannot change. You need to obey. You need to abide by. Then it makes international relations very, very difficult to resolve. This is in addition to the Israeli-Arab conflict, which is dangerous, and I don't like it at all. By the way, not within the Jewish world. In one case, it took to violence the men who murdered Yitzhak Rabin. But in the Muslim world, in many more cases, and I think it's dangerous. I would, of course, if religion becomes benevolent, religion calls for love and friendship and compromise, then it's different. But the way it's interpreted by some people is very, very rigid and non-changeable, non-adaptable to anything. This is dangerous.
Professor Pardo, please.
Eli Pardo from the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University. First of all, I want to thank you for a very interesting and comprehensive talk, and I would like to join my colleague, Professor Moshe Maoz, saying that the Israeli response to the Arab Peace Initiative, unfortunately, was maybe the biggest missed opportunity ever. But that's aside. I think, first of all, as a comment of what I heard, is in relation to the Palestinian policy of pressuring Israel, which is, of course, a correct observation. But I think that that might be seen as a tool, as an instrument, and as a result of Israeli intransigent policy. Because you mentioned that the fact that Abu Mazen was negotiating with Israel, that was in 2007. And so we're talking about the new Netanyahu government and the fact that the Palestinians, Abu Mazen, cannot find in this current government a partner or someone that they can negotiate. And as a result, they turned to the instrument of pressuring Israel, because eventually a solution cannot be imposed. They will have to discuss or negotiate with Israel. So my question is, to what extent, we have heard your own position, but to what extent this current government can indeed promote a dialogue or negotiation, or can offer a peace initiative to the Palestinians or even to the Syrians?
Okay, first of all, I admit, I think you are right. Pressure is a normal tool that is used in international relationship. It has not been invented by us or by them or by anybody that you can think of. Since people are negotiating, they usually accompany it with some sort of pressure, some sort of sticks and carrots, if you like. This is not surprising. And I said that maybe what we see is something that should accompany negotiations. In that respect, we pressure and we give incentives and in all fields of life, and this can be the case here. But there is a problem, at least a question that I want to raise about the suggestion that you made that it has to do with the Israeli government intransigence. I think this is the term you used. This could be the case had history started in 2009. When the government came in office. But there was a negotiation, 280 meetings. 280 meetings. I heard from Udi Deckel, who ran the talks for Ehud Olmert, accompanied by Livni, by Tzipi Livni. 280 meetings in working groups and leadership. Most of them, of course, not the leadership. And it was about 2 or 3 years of negotiations, very intensive, very, I think, well intended by the Israeli side. I'm not defending the previous government. I was not part of it, as you know, and I have nothing, I want to add anything personal here. But I think they meant it seriously. And Olmert broke many taboos, like internationalization. That's the word that I heard. Of the holy basin of Jerusalem, which I don't know how it would have worked, but this is the idea that was put there. After Barak broke the first taboo in Camp David, offering a division of Jerusalem in the old city. So there was negotiation. It reached a point where everything was on the table, the way Olmert puts it. Not this government, the previous one. And there was no response. So it may not be the Israeli position that made them run away from responding to the proposal. Olmert said in one of his interviews, if I hope I quote him not incorrectly, if they want to negotiate, tell them you don't negotiate. You want an answer. There were negotiations. Don't speak of negotiation. You had negotiation. Everything was negotiated. Why don't you answer? So I'm not taking his position because I'm not sure the government of today, I know they will not accept some of the offers Olmert made, to be very candid and open. But, I mean, he had the option. If I were in his shoes, if the account of history is true, this is what I know from what I hear. I wasn't in the room there. I don't understand why, if there was sincerity and there was political power, why Abu Mazen didn't say, I take it. Even if the government would have fallen 2 months later. Who on earth is the Israeli Prime Minister who could have said, I don't recognize what the previous Prime Minister decided? Who in Israel or in the world could ever say this was not legitimate if an Israeli Prime Minister offered it and it would have been accepted, at least as a basis? He didn't do it. So this government is under legitimate criticism, because we are a democracy and it can be criticized. I, from within, in my opinion, my best friend Benny Begin has a different opinion about this. And we have different opinions. But is there a causation? Is there a linkage between the Israeli position now and the fact that they don't want to negotiate? Or, I mean, we had the test. We saw it. It didn't work with the most dovish ever Israeli government just less than 3 years ago, in the end of 2008. So I leave it open. I can't tell you they will not negotiate. But I have to add here some policy that President Obama, I think, described later as a mistake. The policy that came from America saying not a brick, don't build anything or else there won't be negotiations. This is a policy that the Americans started 2 years ago and a year and a half ago. Didn't prove to be successful and not even critical, because I can quote the President of the United States saying we made mistakes. And then, as somebody said, Abu Mazen was left on the tree, the American went down, and he couldn't be less Catholic than the Pope, to take the expression that we use sometimes. And now, for many years, America was against building even Givat Tzarfatit, Ramot Eshkol, or Gilo. But they never linked this to negotiations. Once it was linked, and we have to stop not building in Elon Moreh, not even Malay, we have to stop building in Ramat Eshkol, then it became impossible. So maybe this, somebody had what we in law called contributory negligence in this game. It was not very helpful, I would say. We could have talked, but the fact is that they don't come and talk. And whenever there's a beginning, there's a photo op or two, and then, and they have an alternative policy. If they come and talk, let them challenge us. Let's come and talk. And the world is with them on the idea of Palestinian state. Not on right of return, I hope. Let them come and talk and see if there's an agreement.
Now, you take another one?
Pardon?
Mr. Meridor, you would like to, can I have another one? Because Abba Eban used to say, never talk to a hungry crowd.
Hungry crowd. So if the crowd is hungry...
hungry crowd. Okay, the last question, please.
I would say never talk when you are hungry, so I will not
That's
talk.
That's right, both.
Okay.
You say in
the
beginning...
It says in the Rambam about judges, the judges should never sit in trial when they are hungry.
Ah, yes.
Yeah? One of the rules of judges in Ilchot Melachim, the Rambam, is the judge should not be hungry when he sits in judgments.
That's a good one.
You say in the beginning of your topics that we assist in the return of religion.
Sorry?
We assist in Middle East in return of religion, return of God in Middle East. What's the Israeli answer?
Retour de Dieu, le retour de Dieu politique.
Retour de Dieu. What's the Israeli answer to this big challenge? Because we think that we need a political agreement to resolve this problem. But I think it's not possible. What's the spiritual Israeli response for big challenge in the Middle East? Because for me, we don't have a Jewish God, a Muslim God, and Christian God. We have one God, and the three religions was a different way to have a relation with God. If you don't have a answer response of this big challenge, the problem is not just located in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what's the Israeli spiritual response for the big challenge?
Well, you take me to a different sphere altogether. We all live, I think, in a monotheistic world where if there is God, there is one God and not many gods. Although we love to read the Greek tragedies and the comedies and the mythology, but we don't live in that world. Whether we have one God or everyone has his God in his own image, it's an interesting story. I think that the spiritual part of life is very important, even in politics. I'm not playing it down at all. But I would say that it is hard enough to try to resolve this conflict politically. If you want to resolve it in a deeper sense, that the other side will accept a basic spiritual Weltanschauung, to take a German word that you have, or a basic values system that you have, we may not have had peace with Egypt or Jordan to this very day. Of course, I would love them to agree, and that I agree with them on every sphere of life, including spiritual and religious and whatnot, and the right, and what is right, what is wrong. It's better, but it's somewhat idealistic. Thank God, can I use God here? Begin didn't ask Sadat to accept all this. He asked him to accept peace, no war, agreed boundaries, no more claims, good enough. Rabin didn't ask of Hussein to have an agreement on this, although he might have agreed or not, but to to plunge into that new sphere, which is awfully interesting, intellectually stimulating, is somewhat dangerous. So I would continue to search for spiritual agreements, and I myself am influenced, like all of us, by my spiritual world, of course. But to ask for agreement in the spiritual world as a precondition or an accompanying agreement to making peace will postpone it even further, and it's difficult enough even without this. Anyway, b'te'avon and bon appetit.
Thank you very much.